of the unknown warrior.
Dear Dad, do you remember 20th of July 1941? You even named me Victor.
And the dark curse of Hitler will be lifted.
One year later, you died. By the end of the war, I'd moved 8 times. Life in that orphanage was pretty grim, I have to say. I can tell you, Dad, I was bitter. You were my hero, marathon dancer, movie maker, nightclub owner. Thanks for the life you gave me. Love, Vic. I was an orphan, but on my 8th birthday I got a card just signed Love, Mum, and I thought that was somebody's horrible joke. How cruel can you get? I went to see the house mistress about that, and she said, well, actually your mother is still alive, but she doesn't want anything to do with you. I remember crying under an old beech tree that day. I guess some of the other things I remember are the behavior of the house parents. My house father was really quite a sadist. Unfortunately, I had a habit of wetting the bed. That was bad news in his house, because every morning we'd have to fold our sheets and fold our blankets ready for morning inspection. If they were wet, he'd take his big paw and he'd rub my face in this urine and then give me a whopping across the backside. Not the most effective cure, I have to say. I don't know whether the conditions are what made me start to steal, but somehow I did. Of course, I was caught red-handed. That was another occasion for 6 of the best with his famous strap. It didn't stop me stealing, I have to say. That round about the age of 11, I'd become an inveterate thief. But then I got my great break. This postman and his wife, they decided that they wanted to adopt me. So I'm really excited about this, you know. I'm 11 and I now got a new mum and dad. But unfortunately, I used to break into people's houses at will, sometimes as many as 10 a day. And I was caught by my foster father. So I get on my bike and do the Oliver Twist bit. I ride to London. Except I didn't get to London. I got as far as Basingstoke. I went to sleep in a telephone kiosk. The next thing I know, I'm in the hands of a burly policeman and being taken back to Hollybrook Homes. At 15, I joined the army, but that lasted only for 9 months. They kicked me out of the army because I forged some post office savings books. So I ended up back in Southampton, sometimes living with people, sometimes homeless. On my 18th birthday, I went and I broke into a lot of houses that day. Every teacher I'd ever had told me what a waster I was, what a scoundrel, you'll spend your life in and out of jail. And I accepted that that was my lot in life. And here I was, at the earliest point it was possible for me to be in prison, I was there. There's not a lot to do in prison. You count the bricks on the wall, you know. I spent an awful lot of time feeling sorry for myself. But I had one other companion with me. That was a Bible. I was not a reader. I suffer from dyslexia, so it's quite a challenge for me to read a book, especially one in Old English. But I rather liked Jesus. You know, there was something about this man with great words and yet so down to earth, because the Bible says that foxes have their holes and the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Well, that to me, that's a homeless guy, and I knew what it's like to be homeless, and he liked to take on authority. I think that appealed to me a great deal. But of course, they got him, they put him on a cross. And I thought that was the end of the story, but then it went on to the resurrection. Blew my mind. But then, for some unaccountable reason, I found myself on my knees, crying my eyes out. I guess the last time I'd really cried was when I was 8 years old under that beech tree. Here I was crying my eyes out like a baby. And I prayed to God, God, if you're there, you've got 10 days to change my life. I got up off my knees and I thought, Jackopson, you've gone mad. So I rang the bell and this warden came up. I said, I think I've just become a Christian. So he says, it's the Methodist you want? And next day up comes the Methodist chaplain. And I'm telling him what's happened. He said, oh, I see. Well, you know, this has never ever happened to me before. I said, well, it hasn't happened to you. It's happened to me. He said, well, I don't know quite what to do about this. Now, what shall we do? Yes, I know. We'll send you up the Methodist recorder. And I got back to the Bible. I thought the Bible was much more interesting. There were two big things that really struck me. The first was that everything I'd ever thought about Christianity was wrong. I thought Christianity was just for good people. And here I read in the Bible, Jesus says he's come to seek and to save those that are lost. That Christianity is for bad people. And then the second thing was, Jesus talked about being born again, you know, and things like, you're a new creation. Wow. That means I don't have to live with what's past. So all those angers, all that frustration, all of that is part of the old life. And you put on this new life, and that to me was an enormous encouragement. After prison, I went to live at a probation hostel for a year. When I got there, the fellow called Pitkin used to be the warden. This fellow was really ugly. I mean, big, like a slug stood up, you know. And he said, I've just had a letter from the chaplain of the prison, says you became a Christian. Is that right? So I said, yeah, it is. He says, oh, well, that makes two of us, doesn't it? Now, if we're going to let this load of heathens know in this God-forsaken hole that we belong to Jesus, you're going to tell them, aren't you, lad? I said, no way. He said, are you ashamed of Jesus? After all he's done for you, you get out there, you tell the first man you see. You have to understand that in any institution, doesn't matter what it is, people want to know if you're tough. If you're tough, they're on your side. If you're not, you've had it. I'm downstairs cooking the breakfast. Everything goes quiet. I thought, this is it, Jackopson, get yourself ready. Sure enough, there in the doorway, a guy called Melvin Richards. Oi, Christian, what you gonna do if I clobber you? I said, you hit me and I'll turn the other cheek. Once, because that's all it says in the Bible. Wham! Got me, beautifully. And I mustered all the love I could. And he goes, forget it, Christian, and walked away. Now, 6 weeks later, I was baptized. The minister said, now, anybody who wants to become a Christian, come and stand out the front. And who should come running down the aisle but Melvin Richards? It was years later when I came back to Southampton, and I remembered that the Benkeys, who used to visit Hollybrook Homes, they said, we're going to pray for you until you become a Christian. And the amazing thing was, I went to their house. She said, what date did you become a Christian? I said, 10th of September. So she goes to the bureau, finds her diary for 1959, turns to the 10th of September. And there she's got written, no need to pray for Vic anymore. John Pudney came to see me. John was the missioner for the London Embankment Mission. He said, you be underneath Waterloo Bridge, north side of the Thames, 11 o'clock on Friday night. So I went down there and I'd served some soup and gave out these wads of bread. And then John Pudney slaps me on the back. He says, now go and give them the gospel. I said, do what? He said, go and tell them about Jesus. I said, I can't do that. I said, I'm not a minister. He said, just go and tell them. And there was a guy there And I thought he wouldn't harm a soul. So I went up to him, I says, hey mate, I says, I'm supposed to give you the gospel. Yeah, he says, I know, I get it every week. I said, well, I said, you know more about it than I do then. I said, I don't even know where to start, mate. He says, that's it, mate, you're on your way. And it was as if the Archangel Gabriel came down into that little old tramp and said, well, now this is what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. After I'd been a Christian for a while, I went to live with a Christian family, Alfie and Jenny Weeks, who were amazing people, really put the foundations in place, taught me how to write a letter and how to study the Bible and all sorts of stuff. I'm so thankful for my minister, Frank Goodwin, because one day on the way out from church, he stopped me at the door. He says, Vic, he says, I think God's calling you into the ministry. You need to go to Spurgeon's to get an education. At the end of my 4 years, I took my first church. I was minister in Wandsworth for 6 years. There I met my wife, Sue, who's the best thing that ever happened to me. And in our home in Wandsworth, it was amazing to think, in a 4-year period, we had 364 people live in our home. We had runaways, we had tramps, every kind of drifter under the sun. We started our family. We had Christy and then Ruth. And so thankful to God to have the right person. How important that is for an orphan. When I held my first baby in my arms, Christy, I mean, I cried. I said, oh, God, I'm not ready for this. How do I know how to be a father? And he said to me, you've got a father. Just think, every time you're faced with a challenge, you do what your Heavenly Father would do. I'll tell you what, that's the biggest secret for living a happy Christian family life. We're very proud, of course, of our children. Both went to Oxford. My youngest daughter recently got married. But if I had not become a Christian, what would my children be today? Because what they live with at home is what they eventually become. I'm so grateful that I had that change in my life, that from the word go meant that there was a change in my daughters' lives. When I was 20, I found out where my mother was living, and I went up to see her. Simply knocked on the door and announced myself. And her husband said, well, I've never even heard of a Victor before. So I was the skeleton out of the cupboard. She was running the Abbeydale Golf Club in Sheffield. So she was pretty well off. She'd got a good husband. She got 2 other children that I didn't know about. And the relationship between us was really very strained, very traumatic because of the past. And I started to pray that, A, the relationship would be restored, and secondly, she'd become a Christian. Well, I did that for about 16 years, and not any evidence of any movement. But then one day she was taken into Christie's hospital. She'd got cancer. And I went up to see her. And for the first time, we could actually relate without the past interfering. But then when I went off to America for 3 months with my wife and girls, and while I was there, had a message from home to say that Mum had got secondary cancers, was in a coma, and not expected to live. I got immediately very angry with God. I thought, I've prayed all these years, you know, and you're going to allow her to die without becoming a Christian. And my wife said to me, darling, there's no point you getting angry. Why don't you just go home and see her? I said, well, that's all very well. How am I going to do that? We'd got a bank account, but it was $25 in the red. And we discovered it was going to cost about $800 for the round trip. So Sue said to me, go to the bank and ask for a loan. And eventually I went to see this bank man. His name was Mittendorf, even sounded like a banker, you know. And I told him what I needed and why I needed it. And he said, how wonderful. When I prayed this morning, I asked God to show me one person that I could really help. And here you come, walking into my office, the answer to my prayer. With that, he put $800 on the desk. He said, now that's a gift from God. You go home and see your mother. Well, you can imagine. I mean, we sat in the car park, all four of us crying our eyes out. It was just amazing. I went home. Everybody had gathered. All the family were there. And they said, she won't even know you're here. She's in a coma. But as soon as I walked in that bedroom, she opened her eyes. And she said, Victor, I knew you would come. And I sat on the bed and I explained to her the gospel. She said, it's the most wonderful thing I've heard in my life. And the last thing she did was to pray to receive Christ. She just drifted back into the coma. 3 days later, she was dead. After 6 years in Wandsworth, I took my second church in Godstone, and I was eventually asked to join Evangelism Explosion. I was British director and European director, and really right at the beginning of that time, I suffered acute depression. And this was a real shock to my system, because I've always been an optimistic person, and suddenly to be under this awful cloud. I mean, only those that have been depressed know what that's like. So things were going extremely well, and yet I felt empty. It was as though God got a hold of my life and said, look, now you know you're vulnerable. Now you know you need me. After 9 years with Evangelism Explosion, some things happened that made me feel I've really got to resign, which was difficult. You know, my wife was working for the organization, I was working, we'd been paid well. It was the only time in our lives when we've really been paid well. And we both put in our notice. We sat round the kitchen table and we just prayed, Lord, we don't know what we're doing, but just tell us what to do next. Then went to Czechoslovakia with Jim Irwin, the astronaut. There we were in the biggest stadium in Bratislava, preaching to thousands. Had this amazing opportunity to discuss Christianity with Václav Havel, to pray with him, right on the eve of the elections, to the point that even when he appeared on television, he told the whole nation the content of my prayer. And then I was asked by the Baptist World Alliance to go to Ukraine. And while I was there, the deacons of one of these churches asked me to share with them my background, my testimony. When I got to the point of telling them about prison, the fellow sitting opposite me got very excited. And he said, we can get into the top security prison here and preach the gospel. We've even been given permission to convert a room into a chapel as soon as we have the money. Well, it turned out I'd got exactly the right amount in my back pocket. So I took it out and pushed it across the table. I said, go ahead and build your chapel. 3 months later, I'm invited out to open it. Of course, once the men met me, they said, well, if you've been in prison, you've got to come and teach us. And that, unbeknown to me, was the beginning of the rest of my life. Hope Now, as the organization became called, is positioned in that country as one of the most mature charities in the land. Now we're working with healthcare, with orphans, prisons, education in schools and universities. Sue is really the linchpin of this whole ministry, the whole relationship. She's a great worker. I want to spend thousands and thousands, and just think about it, and so it's perfect balance between us. I've got a great staff here in Southampton, I've got another staff in America, and I've got 13 great guys working for us in Ukraine, all of them Ukrainians. I mean, they know best what's for their country. Write back with some suggestions. I just feel sometimes I'm on a conveyor belt, that God is moving things along, And ultimately, it's his plan that works. One of the great secrets in life is that no human life is wasted. Under God, every human being can live a fulfilled life. The first work we did as Hope Now was really in South Africa, some of the poorest townships. We built a church in Langa. We also built a sports field for a school, put in a new library into the school, and did all sorts of practical work to make the lives of people in the townships a little better. We also did work in the prisons and had an amazing prison ministry in Paulsmoor Prison. That's now come of age. They now have 2 ministries to the prisoners that have grown out of Hope Now. Though we don't do so much down there now, what we're actually seeing is the fruit of the work that was done in the early days. Now much of our concentration has necessarily to be on Ukraine because that's our main field of operation. It gets very cold in winter, 30 degrees below zero. 10% of orphans commit suicide out of despair. These children have no place to go. But the hot water system runs through the sewage. And so they go there. It's rat infested, it's horrible. But I say that no child chooses to live in a sewer unless what they're escaping from is worse than the hell they've gone to. We try to minister to them as best we can, and perhaps my own experience does help because I've been where they are. I know the loneliness. I know the sense of frustration. Life happens to you in an orphanage. You have no say over what's happening. It's just something happens every day where your life is controlled. One tends to think that you're just an individual, and that's all we are. Under God, we're just who we are. But to see lives that are touched, Jesus talked about planting seed, and some bears 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. It's a lot of fun when you see the 100-fold. You see, wow, this is what God is doing, but a little part of that equation of what God is doing is what's happening in one life. I see it in the lives of kids like Alosha. Been homeless since the age of 4. I met him when he was 9 years old. His home was in the cemetery. Lived there with his alcoholic mother. His duty every day, go and beg at the funerals. Get enough money for vodka for his mother. It was obvious. The kid needed looking after, so we started our cottage homes. Here's a guy, didn't start school till he was 10. No state school would take him. We had to put him into private education, pay for it. I had the joy of standing with him on his graduation day. The teacher said something about each of her students. What did she say about Alosha? This young man has a motto over his life. The words hope, faith, and love. He brings all 3 to everyone he meets. I mean, could a father be more proud? He's respected in his church. He leads the young people. I don't know what God is going to do in his life, but that'll be another story.
I am the boy who used to live in the cemetery. My alcoholic mother died of hypothermia, and I didn't even know my father. I want to tell you how my life has changed since I met Vic, the man I now call Dad. I was taken into the First Hope Now cottage home, where Misha and Lena became my foster parents. I stayed with them for 5 years, in which time I went to the First Baptist Church Sunday School. I became a Christian there. I can't tell you how much I owe to Misha and Lena, and especially to my dad Vic. All three have been patient with me while I took sometimes 3 steps forward and 4 steps back. Thankfully, that became more steps forward than back, and today I can honestly say that God is at work in my life. In the new church, I have had many opportunities to develop and become involved in various ministries. For example, I am part of a puppet team which goes out to orphanages and even the rescue shelter where I was as a boy. And I have already preached in 2 churches. I see my future only in terms of serving God. Thanks to God, I was reached in time to save me. Alex Ivanichik.
I love to say to young people in particular, there is no telling what God will do with your life. And you may have blown it. I did. I mean, I started wrong. But there's nothing that I've done in my life that God hasn't used. All the bits that would cause me shame or anger or frustration, bitterness, whatever, I can look at quite openly and say, every one of those God has turned around into a positive. Somebody said to me, with your gifts, you could do all sorts of things in business and you'd be a rich man. But how could I be richer? I have everything I need. I've got a home, I've got clothes on my back, I've got food in my belly, and I've got all these wonderful lives that I can look at and say, God did something there. I can't think of anything more important than that, really. Alosha, dear Alosha, what can I say to you that would not be better said with a hug? There is a God we call Father. He washes filth away. He heals the hurts and gives a brand new life to all who call on him. I know, and now you know. Let him guide you now and always. Love, Mom and Dad.
Дорогу молитвам людей уступить, бесшумные крылья, могучие крылья, наш дух